Will you pray for me? Oil the hinges of our heart's doors, O God, that they may swing gently and easily to welcome your coming. Amen. Do you remember the story of Hamlet? Before the play happens, the old king, King Hamlet, is murdered by his own brother, right? And he takes the crown for himself and he marries his brother's widow. And then the story itself, the play that you see on stage, is the story of young Hamlet, Prince Hamlet, trying to do what the ghost of his father has called upon him to do. The ghost of his father, old dead King Hamlet, shows up before Prince Hamlet and demands justice, demands vengeance, says, "Go, my son, and avenge my death." And for a big chunk of the beginning of the play, the question that Hamlet has in his mind is this really my father? He's not sure if it's a demon or a ghost or a delusion. Hamlet does have problems, right? So he's not sure that he didn't imagine this. So he's asking himself over and over, is this my father? And eventually he becomes convinced that, in fact, it is his father's ghost that showed up there on the ramparts and demanded vengeance. And so he goes out and eventually tries to do it, leading, in the end, to the death of everybody, young Prince Hamlet included, and the taking over of the kingdom by a neighboring kingdom. I want to suggest to you that the question that Hamlet should have been asking there at the beginning was not, is this my father? I was thinking about this question and thinking about Hamlet, thinking about apparitions showing up and demanding justice, because I, maybe like you, over the last weeks, and especially just this last week, have been following the progress of the trial of Jahar Tsarnaev, one of the Boston Marathon bombers. He's been convicted now. We know he's guilty, or at least we assume we are. Certainly, the jury is convinced of it. That part of the proceedings is over, and now they're getting ready to move on to the sentencing phase. How they're going to punish him, how they're going to enact justice upon him for what he has done. And as I've been listening to the reports about the trial, the way it's been going, all the lawyers doing their lawyerly things, I kept hearing about how they were producing pictures of Martin Richard. There were 3 victims of the bombs immediately that day. Martin Richard was one of them, just a little guy. They show pictures of him smiling and grinning in better days, and then they say, I have not seen them, and if you offered to show me, I would not look. They say that they showed pictures of what his body looked like after the bomb, over and over and over there in the courtroom, in excruciating, grueling, gruesome details. Pictures of this tiny little body shredded by violence and fear. They're getting ready, you see, or at least it seems, to ask for the death penalty. Massachusetts doesn't have the death penalty, but for certain cases, the federal government can ask for it. And it would seem that the prosecutors are headed that way, almost certainly. They wanted everyone in that courtroom, but the jurors especially, to see that little body torn apart. First smiling and then shredded over and over and over from every angle you can imagine. They wanted to drive that home. They wanted to raise his specter there in the courtroom so it could demand justice. Or maybe not justice, maybe vengeance. The disciples are there in that upper room. Their leader, their teacher, their beloved mentor has been killed and his body has disappeared, and some people say that he is risen, and they've locked themselves away for fear of what's going to happen if they leave. And he shows up there in their midst with his body torn apart, with those holes in his wrists and in his feet, those tears around his head, and that wound in his side. He shows up there with his body torn apart like a specter. He shows up and says, "Avenge my death." No, he doesn't. What does he show up and say? Peace. He shows up there with his body torn apart, and the first words out of his mouth, not only the first time he shows up, but the second time too, he shows up and says, "Peace." If a specter shows up in your life, if the ghost of your dead father shows up, or the specter of a little boy unconscionably murdered shows up in your life and shows you their wounds, and you're not sure whether it's God talking in that moment, here's how you know. If they say, "I want vengeance," if they say, "Go do to him what he did to me," if they say, "Give her her just deserts," it is not God speaking in that moment. All throughout the ancient Near East, in early Judaism, but in lots of religions as well, there was a religious culture of sacrifice. You would go to the tabernacle or to the temple or to a high place where an altar was built, and a way you would commune with God in those times and in that place. In fact, in most places around the world, was to spill blood. And there was the belief that somehow the spilling of that blood could help make right what was wrong in the world. This is a long tradition going back to the earliest days of humanity, and it sure was strong in Judaism in the early days. Christians, years and years and years after what happened with Jesus, looking back on that event, trying to make sense of it, looked at that long tradition of sacrifice, blood sacrifice in the ancient Near East, and they said, well, this was like that. What happened to Jesus was like that, but here's what happened, they said. Here's the twist they gave it. His was the last sacrifice, they said. And I don't love that way of thinking about Jesus' death. It doesn't work for me, frankly. Thinking of him as somebody that had to be laid out on an altar and have his blood spilled for the fixing of the world, that is not how I understand what happened. But here's what I do like about it. That when he showed up after his death and after his resurrection, what he said with those wounds still in his flesh was, "Never again. This is the last time. Let the bloodshed end with me. Let there be no one stretched on any altar ever again." Not an altar of religion, not the altar of war, not the altar of justice, not the altar of revenge. Let this be the last time, he said. Let it end here. One day somebody's going to raise a specter in front of you, and I want you to remember this, that this story, the story of Jesus, is about bodies from beginning to end. He was born in a body. He grew up in a body. He spent his entire ministry touching bodies, healing bodies, stopping the bleeding of bodies, honoring bodies. They killed his body. And then his followers, they took him down from the cross and cared for his body. They put it carefully in that tomb. And then 3 days later, those women showed up. He was dead and gone, they thought, but they still wanted to honor that body of his. And so they came with their spices and their ointments to clean and anoint every inch of that body. And that body wasn't there. They say that it was risen. And that's what this story was about, right? The body was so real that was standing there in front of them that Thomas could put his own hand right in his side. And it was that body standing there pierced that showed up and said, "Peace." So if somebody raises a specter in front of you, the specter of a body that has been torn apart or killed, pierced or murdered, here's the question to ask. about that body, but not just that body, the bodies of the people all around it, the ones who did the deed and the ones who were horrified by the deed. Here's the thing to ask: is God speaking in this moment? And here's how you'll know that it's God speaking. She will stand there before you and say, peace. Amen.